Well, tonight we're talking about providence. We're talking about a God who is indeed sovereign. That means He is the ruler, that He is supreme, that He is above everyone else and everything else. However, God is also a God of goodness. He is a God of love. And when these two come together, we find God's providence. The word providence refers to God's guidance and care. When you think about the word providence, just think of how God provides for His people. God provides for His creation. You know, God, He is still active today. He is one that works behind the scenes, but God is still taking care of His creation. There is a sense of a general providence that God looks out for and takes care of His creation at large. We read in Matthew chapter 5:45, "For He makes His sun rise on the evil and the good, and He sends His rain on the just and the unjust." God still takes care of His creation. But we also see a special kind of providence, the kind of care that God shows to those who are faithful to Him. Of course, we know in Proverbs 3, verse 6, in all our ways we're called to acknowledge God, and He'll do what? He'll direct our steps. He will take care of us. You know, I look at two individuals in the Old Testament outside of Ruth, and I think of Joseph. We studied Joseph back in November, and we saw a young man who went through some of the most difficult times that we could ever imagine, yet he somehow not only became second in command, was not only able to save his family, but to save all the nations. And that was through God's providence. And then, of course, we looked at Esther a few weeks back, and we saw more of the providence that God had for His people. That even though the Jewish nation was still somewhat under bondage, that they still didn't have their own land back, and they didn't have their own freedom back, that there was this plot to get them, to kill them all, wipe them all out. And Mordecai told Esther, maybe this is why God has put you in this kingdom for times such as this. We saw that God was still working behind the scenes. A lot of times people wonder what's the difference between a providence event from God, God's providence, and then a miracle. We often read of miracles in Scripture, both Old and New Testament. Well, miracles were special moments in time in which the laws of nature were suspended in order to signify a message or a person was from God. Often prophets would tell individuals the future, not necessarily predict. They would tell them the future. And based on whether these things came to pass or not, it demonstrated that these prophets were from God. Of course, we know all the signs that Jesus performed, these miracles, especially we see 7 in John, they signify that He was from God and that He was God. Well, providence, it's more of a tricky situation. God is not limited to a select sign or a select miracle. God can continually work in our lives today. Miracles are a sign of God's endorsement. However, God's providential work is not so obvious. It's something that may take us years to recognize, to see how God has cared for us. Well, tonight we're going to see that while Naomi was distraught, Ruth went to work. In Ruth chapter 2, we will see God's tender care as well as how Ruth was able to accept His providence. Well, let's look together, beginning at verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor." And Naomi said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." So let's notice this chance encounter. You know, this roll of the dice, so to speak, this coincidence. And I put marks around coincidence or chance, because as we will see in this section, that there was nothing left to chance in Ruth chapter 2. We find this sense of Naomi's dysfunction and Ruth's determination. Naomi is a bit older, but she hasn't really done anything to take care of them. And time has come for Ruth to say, Naomi, I'm going to take care of us. Would you let me go and work in the field? And I think about this with Ruth. Naomi was so overwhelmed that she called herself bitter. But where was Ruth's mindset? Had Ruth also suffered loss? See, she had lost her husband. She had lost her brother-in-law. She had lost the essence of the family. The household had been broken apart. And now here she is in a strange land that she's just going to have to try to find work so that they can survive. But think about where Ruth is. While Naomi is here and she is overwhelmed with grief and sorrow and bitterness, Ruth decides that she needs to press on, that she needs to move forward so that she can take care of herself and for her mother-in-law. Now, what we're reading about regarding the field is that under the law of Moses, the landowners were supposed to leave the corners, the portions of the field, unharvested. So that way those who are poor, orphans and widows, as well as sojourners, strangers, could come and take part of the harvest. It was God's generous gift. It was a demonstration of God's grace toward those who were without. It was His way of taking care of His people, and this was to be done by every landowner. However, there's a caveat. If you remember at the end of Judges chapter 21, verse 25, we're told that every person did what was right in his own eyes. See, they weren't too concerned with God's law, with God's teaching. All throughout Judges, we see the people of Israel constantly going to God, being faithful to Him, falling away. God allowed another nation to come in, subdue them. They repented. They came back to God. God relented of what He had done. He raised up a judge, a mighty hero, led His people out of captivity. The hero would die. The next generation would rebel against God again. So who's to say that this young woman, who's a widow, who's a Moabite, would find any kind of work? Well, it just so happened. I love that phrase. Not only Ruth chapter 2, but whenever we read it in Scripture, I think it's sort of a hint of providence at work. Let's remember that providence is tricky. There's no guarantee that something is providential. We might lose our job and say, well, that's God's providence. Or we might be moving to another state and say, well, that's God's providence. Often providence is something that you only notice down the road. That you can look back at your life and say, I can't imagine things going this way, yet somehow God was there taking care of me. Again, as Mordecai said to Esther, and who knows whether or not. That is the essence of providence. But I want you to notice the coincidences as we read just the first 7 verses. Follow with me here, the coincidences. Ruth happened to come to a portion of the field belonging to Boaz. Boaz happened to be a worthy man who would still be keeping the law of Moses. And Boaz happened to have a connection with Naomi, who was, of course, connected with Ruth. We continue on that she happened to be working during the time that he came back from Bethlehem, where he happened to notice her as he greeted the reapers. And then he just happened to ask the foreman who this woman was. And this foreman, who obviously had to manage the work being done and had so many under his care, happened to mention that she was not only connected to Naomi, but he portrayed her in a positive light. I just think about chance, coincidence. That foreman could have said anything about this woman. Ruth could have decided to end work early, start work late. But she set an example. Boaz could have spent weeks or months before checking in on the harvest. But all these things just so happen to coincide. And I think about chances, and I think about God's care. That even when we're suffering, even when we are downcast, even when we feel like we're being overwhelmed, that we're drowning in despair, God is still silently working to bring us peace. It just so happens. I think about Ruth. The Lord led Ruth to the field of Boaz, and then the Lord led Boaz to Ruth. And we'll see why that's more significant as we get further and further into our study. I was reading a passage on this text, and one comment that a Christian author wrote was, when we commit ourselves to the Lord, what happens to us happens by way of appointment and not by accident. Well, let's continue on. So we see a lot of happenstance, a lot of what we might call chance. I would happen to call providence. Well, let's notice what happens when chance meets character. And we don't have time to read this whole passage, but I want to catch some of the highlights. Boaz, verse 8, said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go and glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go down to the vessels and drink the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me? Since I am a stranger, I am a foreigner." But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoke kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." Let's just think about what's being said. See, here is the thing about providence. It heavily depends on the character of the person. I want you to think about the character of Ruth. Just in chapter 2, just in the first 16 verses or so. First of all, she went and asked permission from Naomi that she could serve. That demonstrated respect. Then she went and showed respect to the foreman by asking his permission to serve. She demonstrated diligence. She demonstrated persistence. She demonstrated hard work by working from early morning, working all the way to evening, as we read in verse 17, only taking a short rest here and there so she could regain her strength. I want you to think about the respect that she showed to Boaz. She bowed before him. That wasn't a sign of worship. That was a sign of respect. I want you to think about how loyal she was to her mother-in-law, who hadn't shown to this point, from what we know, a whole lot of care for her daughter-in-law. In fact, it seems as though she had forgotten about her daughter-in-law completely in chapter 1 when she said that she was alone. I want you to think about Ruth. I want you to think about the appreciation in verse 13 that she gives to Boaz. She thanks him for the concern, the compassion that he has shown her. So Ruth was humble, she was respectful, she was hardworking, and she was thankful for what she'd been given. Now, how many Christians can say that they have these attributes at all, let alone when they're suffering? I want you to think about, if you were going through what Ruth had experienced, would you be so quick to be humble, so quick to be respectful, to show appreciation? Would we be quick to work at all? This was who Ruth happened to be. Then I want you to think about Boaz. I want you to think about what kind of man he was. He was called a worthy man in verse 1. Again, I love the narration of chapter 2, because chapter 2 begins as though the author can't help himself to say, now Boaz, he was a worthy man. Well, let me not jump ahead of myself, and began telling the story of Ruth. But we're told that he's worthy, that he's a valiant man, a warrior, and he's wealthy, but not to the point where he is arrogant, he is proud, or he is greedy. He is wise because he continually checks in on his fields. He happens to show kindness by greeting his reapers. Those are the day laborers. Why do they deserve any kind of respect from this man? He was wise by checking in with the foreman when he sees someone he does not recognize. When he hears about Ruth, he offers her protection by saying, no one's going to lay a hand on you, Ruth. He also does something very unique. He shows equality to her. First, he shows it by offering her water from his servants. Second, he gives her a place at the table to sit. Now, that may not seem like a lot to us, but in this day and age, a woman went and got water from a man, not the other way around. Furthermore, she was a foreigner. She wasn't an Israelite. Yet he offered her water. He showed her compassion. He offered her a place at the table where his workers decided to eat. That probably wasn't where a lot of women ate, especially one like Ruth. He praised her for her treatment of her mother-in-law. He showed her love. As we continue reading in verse 15, that not only did she rise to work, whenever she did that, he not only had his servants help her by not giving her any fuss, but in verse 16 he said, pull out some of the bundles we have and give it to her. I want you to think about how in such a land of lawlessness, we might think of the Wild Wild West. In the Wild Wild West, in the land of lawlessness, we have two individuals, humble, respectful, compassionate, loving, wise, meet together. Again, when we think about providence, we think about how God takes care of us. God takes our actions, both large and small, and He works them into His plan. However, His providence is dependent upon our actions. That doesn't mean that if we try to refuse God and His word and His will, that doesn't mean God's will won't come about. Rather, what it means is God's will shall come about. We just won't be included in it. However, when we trust God, when we show God that we trust in Him, even when we don't know that God's work is at play, but we show characteristics that are godly, God takes care of us. While Naomi was blinded by her bitterness and actually believed that God was out to get her, Ruth was open to His plan. I want you to imagine for a moment if Ruth had shown a sense of entitlement to Boaz by saying, well, I have connections with Naomi. You better let me work on this field. Would he have been so compassionate toward her? If while she was working and he was talking to her and he brought up her mother-in-law and she said, oh, let me tell you about her. Let me tell you how she's treated me. Do you think he would have praised her so much? Given her a spot at the table? I think about how Ruth could have shown anger toward God. When Boaz said, you will reap a reward from the Lord, she could have said, oh, let me tell you what my mother-in-law says about God. She says that God has forsaken us. That's not what Ruth did. It's so tempting for us to become complainers, to blame others, to be angry toward God. And it makes me think, how often has God extended His hand of grace only for us to brush it aside due to our pride? Yet what happens when chance meets character is that God provides for us. And I think about how God is working. As Ruth found grace in the eyes of Boaz, so do we find grace in the eyes of God. Let's wrap up the story this morning, or this evening. As we close in verse 17 to the end of the chapter, we see the impact of God's providence. And she took it up and went into the city. Back up to verse 17. So she gleaned in the field till evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, this man's name with whom I worked today is Boaz. Now notice verse 20. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by whom? By the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, this man is a close relative of our husband, one of our redeemers. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Now, I don't think I mentioned this at the beginning of this lesson, but I mentioned it 2 weeks ago. I labeled this series The Gospel According to Naomi. I do believe that Ruth is the main character of the book of Ruth. However, I believe that we have a better understanding of the transformation that occurs in Naomi. Although Ruth is more mentioned than Naomi, it seems to me that there should be a focus on this woman that at the beginning she seemed like she was good, and then she went to bitterness and she began a downward spiral, and then in chapter 2 she begins thinking. There's a change. There's a different current. You think about the idea of a movie, there's a plot twist. And Naomi begins to express hope. Think about this passage with me. Think about this change of heart. See, when Ruth showed up to Naomi's house, you know, Ruth was gone a long time, as Naomi has indicated, and as Boaz has indicated. This was dangerous. This was a dangerous work for a young woman, especially a Moabite. Ruth shows up, and she not only shows up with a day's work, but she shows up with 2 gifts. First of all, she had taken from the table enough to satisfy her, and then she set some food aside. She was still thinking about her mother-in-law. She gave food to Naomi from Boaz's table. Second, she brings an ephah of barley, and scholars aren't fully sure of how much a measurement was, but from what we can gather from what I've read, that an ephah of barley would feed 2 people an entire week. So she brought a week's worth of wages in one day. And she would continue bringing in an ephah of barley for the next 6 to 7 weeks, so long as the harvest lasted. And I think about what has happened. At first, Naomi, she's shocked. You imagine that Ruth has so much that she could probably barely bring it into the house. Naomi says, who did this? Blessed be his name. Thank goodness for him. I'm glad you found someone that took good care of you. And then Ruth drops the bombshell. Oh, the man who did this, his name is Boaz. And I imagine the light bulb finally going off for Naomi. Because she then praises someone that she hasn't talked to in a long time. God. She goes from just praising this man to praising this man in the name of the Lord. And she describes God in this way. That he was one who demonstrated kindness, who had not forsaken the living and the dead. Well, wait, what happened to Mara? What happened to being bitter? What happened to blaming God? What happened to him being almighty and bringing you back empty? Naomi, what happened? Naomi recognized the name of Boaz, and that it was possible for him to be a kinsman redeemer. We'll talk about what that means more next week. But essentially that it was possible for him under the Mosaic law to marry Ruth and further the line of Naomi's husband. See, when God gives us opportunity through his care, and we embrace that opportunity through godly character, the outcome is hope. This woman went from hopelessness and bitterness to confidence. There's a certain energy that we read in 20 through 23. Naomi saw God in a new light, and she was energized for the first time by this hope. I think about Romans 8, verse 28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. Not just some things. Not just most things. Everything. All things work together for good. That doesn't mean every single thing that happens in our life is going to be just great. What it means is God uses those moments, those events, and He makes us better. And in the end, He brings us peace so long as we're called according to His purpose, as long as we embrace His will. As we close tonight, I want to tell you about a living hope. This is not the end of the story for Ruth. In fact, we're halfway done. And in fact, we're at this moment of concern because the harvest is ending. What's going to happen to Ruth? What's going to happen to Naomi? What's going to happen to Boaz? This is the moment, by the way, if we're watching a TV show, I'd say tune in next time as we continue on in the story of Ruth. But there's a lot occurring here, all according to God's plan. Here's what we can take away from Ruth chapter 2. Number one, Naomi's not a villain. She's overcome with sorrow. I think every one of us can relate to Naomi. When we see a Christian brother or sister who is caught up in bitterness and sorrow, we shouldn't villainize them. We should gently remind them of God's love. We should be patient with them. We should mourn with them. And we should help them the way that Ruth helped Naomi. The second thing we take away from Ruth chapter 2 is God's tender care is still active today. Even in a time of lawlessness, even in a time where people disregard God's word, God is still taking care of His people. He does it silently. He does it behind the curtain, behind the scene. But He gently works to not only protect His flock, but bring joy to His children. The third thing we can take away from Ruth chapter 2 is that Ruth was one who unknowingly embraced God's providence through her humble spirit. We may not know when God's providence is at work, but we can embrace it all the same by being the person He's called us to be, no matter how high or low our life might be at the moment. She still demonstrated God's character. Finally, through Ruth's character and Ruth's news, Naomi went from bitterness to hope. One person trusting in the Lord and obeying His will can change a situation from defeat to victory. You can make that impact on someone tonight. See, when we think about providence, I think about Jesus Christ. Because while we do see great hope in Naomi, we're offered an even greater hope, a living hope. Because Jesus did not die based on an accident. Because God's plan wasn't really working the way that Jesus thought it would. That He was surprised by the Romans who came to arrest Him. See, none of that was accidental. Happenstance. Everything, as we read in Acts chapter 2, everything that occurred with Jesus was delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God so that we could be saved. Let God's providence work in your life tonight. We may not recognize it, but when we embrace who God is, no matter how difficult our life might seem, God's work finds a way for us. And all things work together for the good. If you need to become a child of God tonight, if you need to be baptized so your sins may be washed away, make that happen now. Perhaps God has provided this hour for you to have your life made right with God. Maybe you just need prayers tonight. Maybe you need to confess sins as Lawrence and Carlos did this morning. Don't walk away thinking there might be another chance. Use the opportunity God has given you today. If you need anything at all, come now while we stand, while we sing.